Could a single nationwide raid on convenience stores shake both the business world and the immigration debate? That was the question raised in September 2025, when U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE carried out its most sweeping workplace enforcement operation in years. Nearly 100 7-Eleven franchises across 17 states were suddenly targeted. By sunrise, agents had seized more than 1,200 fake IDs, detained dozens of suspects, and sent a chilling message through the retail sector. Under the Trump administration, this was not just about punishing undocumented workers, it was about striking at the very employer magnet that critics say fuels illegal migration. The operation unfolded like a military campaign. Teams of ICE Homeland Security Investigations HSI officers stormed stores in Texas, California, Florida, and New York almost simultaneously, while analysts at command centers monitored progress in real time. According to internal reports, the raids were months in the making, with undercover agents posing as job seekers to expose franchise owners knowingly hiring staff with forged documents. The scale was unprecedented for a retail chain, dwarfing earlier stings against meatpacking plants or agricultural contractors. Why 7-Eleven analysts point out that the brand is both ubiquitous and heavily franchised, making it vulnerable to uneven compliance standards. Some owners facing constant labor shortages allegedly turned to underground networks supplying workers with fraudulent social security numbers. Officials claim this created not only unfair competition, but also serious national security risks, as stolen identities are often linked to larger forgery operations run by criminal groups. Jane's Defense Weekly noted that these same smuggling networks have been tied to cartel logistics chains, suggesting a direct overlap between document fraud and transnational organized crime. The Trump administration's framing was blunt. Businesses that skirt the law are not only exploiting labor, but endangering the security of our country. An ICE spokesman declared, echoing the White House's broader message that interior enforcement is just as critical as border walls. This aligns with the so-called employer magnet theory, the idea that the U.S. labor market, not just porous borders, is what drives undocumented migration. By hitting a corporate giant, officials aim to demonstrate deterrence far beyond the usual small business raids. The timing also carried geopolitical undertones, with U.S. attention split between foreign crises, Ukraine resisting intensified Russian drone and missile attacks Israel and Iran, trading strikes in the Middle East, and Chinese naval maneuvers testing American resolve in the Pacific. The administration was signaling that homeland security remained uncompromised. Defense News commented that the same logistical precision used in coordinating NATO's Baltic air policing missions appeared mirrored in ICE's domestic strategy, rapid deployment, intelligence-driven targeting, and synchronized execution across multiple fronts. Community reactions were polarized. Some hailed the operation as a long overdue stand against law-breaking corporations. Others, particularly immigrant rights groups, accused ICE of creating fear in entire neighborhoods. In Los Angeles, crowds gathered outside shuttered stores, some angry at owners, others devastated at the sudden loss of jobs. Economists warned of ripple effects as local supply chains and franchises scrambled to replace workers. This is not just about raids, it's about whether America is prepared for the economic fallout of strict enforcement, a Reuters business analyst observed. The immediate result was undeniable. More than 100 franchise owners faced potential criminal charges, and the corporate headquarters of 7-Eleven rushed to distance itself, pledging stricter compliance audits. Yet the deeper question lingers: does dismantling networks of fake identities and penalizing employers truly curb illegal migration, or does it merely push it further underground? As this first wave of analysis shows, the ICE crackdown was designed not just as law enforcement, but as a message. But what exactly did it reveal about America's vulnerabilities, and how do those vulnerabilities connect to the broader international security picture? The employer magnet theory has long been debated in policy circles. According to ICE leadership, illegal migration is sustained less by porous borders and more by the promise of steady work once inside the United States. This theory shaped the September 2025 raids, target the businesses that knowingly hire undocumented workers, and the flow of labor migration would weaken. By striking nearly 100 7-Eleven franchises, ICE demonstrated how enforcement can move from reactive arrests at the border to proactive disruption within the domestic economy. Veteran analysts note that this approach is not new, but has rarely been executed at such scale. Past administrations often favored workplace audits issuing fines rather than staging headline-grabbing raids. What made this different was the Trump administration's determination to treat employment violations with the same urgency as cross-border smuggling. According to the BBC, officials described the raids as strategic signaling intended to remind employers that hiring undocumented workers is not just a civil violation, but a criminal act with national security consequences. The legal foundation for the crackdown rests on the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which made it unlawful to knowingly hire unauthorized workers. Yet for decades, enforcement has been inconsistent. Employers often relied on cursory checks of identification documents, many of which were forged. ICE's investigation into 7-Eleven franchises revealed systemic abuse of these loopholes, with some owners accused of paying workers off the books or using stolen social security numbers. The Department of Justice confirmed that more than 1,000 fake or stolen identities were seized, exposing just how porous workplace verification can be. Here, the employer magnet theory collides with modern reality. While officials argue that tougher enforcement will dry up incentives for illegal migration, critics counter that such crackdowns risk driving workers into even more exploitative underground markets. Al Jazeera highlighted testimony from labor advocates who warned that displaced employees often reappear in smaller, less regulated sectors, restaurants, construction sites, and even private homes where oversight is nearly impossible. But supporters of the raids see deterrence as the overriding goal. If you remove the profit motive for businesses, the magnet weakens, said a retired ICE director quoted in The Guardian. This perspective aligns with the administration's broader law and order narrative, presenting corporate accountability as a tool of immigration control. By focusing on employers rather than only workers, officials seek to reduce both the demand for illegal labor and the political backlash against targeting vulnerable individuals. The strategy also resonates with parallel enforcement models abroad. Germany, facing its own migrant labor challenges, has tightened workplace inspections and imposed harsher fines on companies found in violation. DW reported that Berlin recently authorized surprise raids on logistics firms suspected of relying on undocumented Eastern European workers. In both cases, the central message is the same economic incentives drive migration, and disrupting them is as important as border patrols. Yet analysts remain divided on effectiveness. A senior fellow at the Brookings Institution noted that unless such measures are paired with expanded legal pathways for labor, they risk creating labor shortages in key sectors. Already, some 7-Eleven franchises have reported difficulties staffing overnight shifts, raising questions about long-term sustainability. Reuters cited data showing that more than 2/3 of convenience stores nationwide rely heavily on immigrant labor, suggesting that blanket enforcement could ripple through the entire retail economy. This tension reveals the core dilemma: how to balance national security with economic pragmatism. ICE's application of the employer magnet theory through the 7-Eleven raids is both a demonstration of force and a test case. Will punishing high-profile employers deter others, or will it simply push illegal employment into harder-to-detect corners of the economy? The answer may lie in the deeper networks uncovered by the raids themselves. What happens when the trail of forged identities and stolen social security numbers leads not just to convenience stores, but to organized crime syndicates operating on a global scale? The raids revealed a darker layer beyond labor violations: the intricate supply chains of forged identities that underpin much of the shadow economy. More than 1,200 counterfeit or stolen IDs were seized in the September 2025 operation. But what concerned investigators most was where these documents originated. According to ICE reports cited by Reuters, many of the fraudulent social security numbers were traced back to organized forgery rings with connections to both domestic gangs and transnational networks. In practice, these supply chains function like black market logistics. Criminal groups in Mexico and Central America generate streams of fake documents, driver's licenses, green cards, and social security cards before channeling them through smugglers into the US labor market. The BBC reported that some of these rings even used advanced printing technology, making the IDs sophisticated enough to bypass basic employer checks. Once inside the system, stolen identities enable undocumented workers to find jobs, pay taxes under false credentials, and even access credit. For law enforcement, this poses not only an immigration challenge, but a cybersecurity threat, as American citizens whose identities are stolen often face years of financial damage. The 7-Eleven raids highlighted vulnerabilities in the federal E-Verify system designed to authenticate employee eligibility, though widely promoted E-Verify struggles to catch stolen but valid social security numbers. The system can confirm the number exists, but it doesn't prove the applicant is the rightful owner, explained a security analyst quoted by Defense News. This loophole has become a key entry point for criminal supply chains. The raids exposed dozens of workers using identities of deceased citizens, some of them veterans, raising alarms about systemic weaknesses. Experts warn that these forgery networks overlap with broader criminal enterprises. Jane's Defense Weekly pointed to evidence that some document forgery profits have been funneled into cartel operations financing weapons purchases and cross-border smuggling. In one case, authorities found forged IDs alongside shipments of fentanyl precursors destined for Midwest distribution hubs. This convergence of illegal labor identity theft and narcotics trafficking underscores how the issue extends far beyond low-wage employment disputes. The US is not alone in facing these risks. European intelligence agencies have reported similar problems with forged Eastern European passports turning up in both terrorist cells and migrant labor scams. DW emphasized that Europol has long flagged identity fraud as one of the most profitable sectors for organized crime, rivaling drug trafficking in sheer volume. The parallels suggest a global marketplace in which fake documents are traded as commodities, enabling not just migration but also illicit finance and covert mobility. The Trump administration has vowed to tighten the net. Officials are reportedly pushing for biometric verification systems, fingerprint and facial recognition checks to supplement paper IDs. However, civil liberties groups argue such measures risk overreach and raise privacy concerns. The Guardian quoted experts warning that an over-reliance on surveillance could alienate immigrant communities and erode trust in local law enforcement, making genuine cooperation harder to secure. For seasoned analysts, the raids illustrated how immigration enforcement cannot be separated from national security. Fake IDs are not simply tools for undocumented workers. They are nodes in a wider criminal ecosystem. Left unchecked, they allow hostile actors, whether cartel couriers, cyber criminals, or foreign intelligence assets, to move through society undetected. This convergence of crime and migration is precisely what makes workplace raids both controversial and strategically significant. As ICE dismantles these networks, a key question emerges: how did interagency coordination and tactical planning make the raids so successful? And what does that reveal about America's ability to project precision operations at home and abroad? The September 2025 raids were not improvised sweeps, but carefully orchestrated operations resembling military campaigns. ICE's Homeland Security Investigations Division worked with federal prosecutors, local police, and even airport authorities to ensure that no suspect could simply vanish once the raids began. According to Reuters, more than 2,000 agents were deployed across 17 states in synchronized waves, hitting 7-Eleven franchises at dawn. This level of precision drew comparisons to joint task force operations used in counterterrorism and narcotics interdiction. Operational planning began months earlier when undercover agents posed as job applicants to gather evidence of fraudulent hiring. Intelligence was cross-checked with databases of stolen Social Security numbers flagged by the Social Security Administration and the Department of Labor. Once clear patterns emerged, ICE coordinated with U.S. attorneys to secure search warrants. The synchronization of warrants across multiple jurisdictions is a lesson in operational tempo, observed a retired Defense Department strategist quoted in DW. The goal was to strike quickly and broadly, preventing word from spreading and suspects from fleeing. Tactical execution relied on interagency coordination. Local police departments provided outer security perimeters, ensuring public safety, while ICE teams conducted interviews inside stores. In New York and Florida, Customs and Border Protection agents were stationed at major airports to prevent franchise owners under investigation from escaping the country. The Guardian noted that some suspects attempted to board international flights hours after the raids, but were intercepted thanks to prearranged watch lists. The operational parallels with military doctrine were striking. Defense News highlighted how the raids mirrored principles of intelligence fusion and multi-domain synchronization concepts typically applied to NATO exercises against Russian aggression in Eastern Europe. Just as NATO integrates air, land, cyber, and maritime assets in the Baltic region, ICE integrated legal, local, and federal resources to achieve overwhelming surprise and control. For a domestic law enforcement operation, the scale was unprecedented. Yet the raids also exposed challenges. Some local jurisdictions, particularly sanctuary cities, were reluctant to cooperate, raising friction that mirrored the broader debate between federal authority and local autonomy. Al Jazeera reported tense exchanges in California where city officials accused ICE of undermining community trust. From ICE's perspective, however, such resistance only underscored the need for federal leadership in matters of national security. The success of the raids has already influenced tactics in unrelated fields. Homeland Security officials have reportedly briefed military planners on lessons learned, particularly in coordinating dispersed operations across time zones and jurisdictions. Analysts note that the experience could prove valuable as the US considers scenarios involving simultaneous crises abroad, such as deterring Chinese naval probes in the South China Sea while maintaining readiness in Europe and the Middle East. The transfer of operational doctrine between domestic and foreign theaters is increasingly fluid. However, seasoned analysts caution against overstating the victory. Tactical brilliance does not resolve strategic dilemmas. While the raids dismantled a network of non-compliant franchises, the broader challenge of undocumented labor remains. Without systemic reforms, experts warn such operations risk becoming symbolic rather than transformative. You can't raid your way out of a structural problem, a senior policy advisor told the BBC. Still, the immediate operational takeaway is clear. When interagency coordination is seamless, the US can execute precise, large-scale operations with minimal disruption to public order. The question now is whether the economic and social ripples from these raids will undermine their tactical gains or reinforce the deterrent message. When the dust settled, the impact of the 7-Eleven raids spread far beyond the storefronts. Franchise owners suddenly faced massive labor shortages, with many stores unable to operate overnight shifts or meet supply demands. According to Reuters, some franchises reported revenue drops of more than 30% within weeks, forcing emergency staffing adjustments. Suppliers too felt the shock, as distribution schedules were disrupted by stores temporarily closing or reducing hours. The financial penalties added another layer of strain. ICE and the Department of Justice confirmed that franchise owners found complicit in hiring undocumented workers could face fines exceeding $10,000 per violation, alongside criminal charges for identity theft and tax evasion. For small business owners, these fines were devastating. A corporate compliance officer told the BBC that the raids are a wake-up call. Compliance is no longer optional, it's survival. Yet the most profound effects were social. In immigrant-heavy neighborhoods, fear spread quickly. Families worried about parents being detained at work, children feared losing breadwinners, and communities grew wary of even entering convenience stores. The Guardian reported accounts of customers boycotting franchises tied to arrests, while immigrant advocacy groups organized protests condemning ICE's tactics as collective punishment. Some sanctuary cities vowed to expand legal aid for detained workers, deepening the clash between federal enforcement and local policy. Economists highlighted broader risks. The U.S. convenience store industry employs more than 1 million workers nationwide, with immigrant labor forming a critical backbone. DW noted that if raids expand to other chains, the ripple effect could destabilize entire supply networks from food distributors to logistics hubs. Wage theft lawsuits also began to surface, with workers alleging that some franchise owners withheld pay under the guise of off-the-books arrangements. These suits, now moving through federal courts, threaten to expose further layers of exploitation. Supporters of the operation counter that these disruptions are the necessary cost of restoring legal order. If businesses play by the rules, labor markets stabilize, wages rise, and exploitation declines, argued a senior policy fellow quoted by Defense News. Advocates of stricter enforcement claim that while the short-term pain is real, the long-term outcome could be a fairer labor market where employers compete legally. They point to data from the Department of Labor suggesting that industries forced into compliance often experience productivity gains and wage increases over time. But critics warn of a darker trajectory. Al Jazeera highlighted the risk of displaced workers being funneled into unregulated sectors such as agriculture and construction, where oversight is weaker and exploitation more severe. In effect, raids may not eliminate illegal employment, but scatter it into shadows, making it harder to monitor and control. For communities already caught between economic survival and legal vulnerability, the pressure is immense. The political fallout is equally sharp. President Trump praised the raids as a clear message that America protects its workers first, while opposition leaders accused the administration of weaponizing fear. NATO allies observing from abroad drew parallels to their own domestic debates, particularly in Europe, where migrant labor has become a flashpoint amid rising populism. A German defense analyst quoted by DW noted that internal cohesion is as critical to national defense as external deterrence. America's challenge here mirrors ours in Europe. The immediate effects are clear economic disruption, social polarization, and sharpened debates on federal authority. Yet the long-term question remains unresolved: will such enforcement stabilize the system or simply deepen the fractures within U.S. society? And more importantly, how does this domestic enforcement strategy fit into America's global posture as conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Pacific intensify? The strategic trajectory of these raids points far beyond retail storefronts. At its core, the September 2025 crackdown signals a pivot in U.S. immigration enforcement from focusing solely on the border to reshaping corporate liability and compliance nationwide. Analysts argue this trajectory could redefine how businesses operate under the Trump administration. Reuters reported that policymakers are considering mandatory nationwide adoption of E-Verify coupled with biometric upgrades as a condition for retaining federal contracts. If enacted, this would represent the most sweeping compliance reform since the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. The strategic implications reach NATO and Western allies as well. Internal cohesion and resilience are essential for credibility abroad. DW emphasized that allies are closely watching America's ability to maintain stability at home while projecting force overseas. If domestic vulnerabilities such as porous employment systems and criminal ID networks remain unresolved, adversaries like Russia and China may perceive them as pressure points to exploit. Indeed, Al Jazeera highlighted how disinformation campaigns often weaponize immigration debates to polarize societies, weakening democratic unity from within. For businesses, the trajectory is clear. Liability is expanding. Jane's Defense Weekly noted that companies implicated in repeated violations may face not just fines, but potential forfeiture of franchise licenses. This shift mirrors broader defense procurement standards where contractors can be barred for compliance failures. Such alignment indicates that Washington views immigration enforcement not as a separate silo, but as part of a national security framework that demands integrity across both public and private sectors. Western experts caution, however, that enforcement must be balanced by civil rights safeguards. The Guardian quoted constitutional scholars warning that without oversight, aggressive ID verification could lead to profiling and erosion of privacy. Policymakers are therefore exploring metrics to balance deterrence with trust, measuring not just arrests and fines, but also community cooperation rates, reduction in identity theft cases, and resilience of critical supply chains. Geopolitically, the raids echo broader debates in Europe and Asia. In Germany, DW reported authorities are piloting AI-driven verification tools to monitor logistics companies employing Eastern European drivers. In Japan, biometric entry-exit systems have been tightened to prevent overstays from turning into shadow labor markets. These parallels suggest a convergence among advanced economies toward treating illegal employment as a hybrid security risk, part criminal, part economic, part geopolitical. Veteran analysts emphasize that the U.S. must integrate these domestic reforms into its global strategic posture, with NATO reinforcing Eastern Europe against Russian aggression, Israel trading missile strikes with Iran, and Chinese naval incursions testing U.S. alliances in the Pacific. Washington cannot afford to appear fractured at home. Domestic resilience underpins deterrence abroad, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council told BBC News. If America shows that it can clean its internal vulnerabilities, its global commitments gain credibility. The future will hinge on whether reforms become systemic. If biometric E-Verify and corporate liability take hold, raids like the one against 7-Eleven may become rare symbolic milestones rather than constant campaigns. But if political polarization stalls reforms, enforcement risks becoming cyclical, dramatic raids followed by slow erosion of deterrence. As one seasoned ICE official observed, the question isn't whether we can run operations, it's whether we can fix the system so we don't need them. Thus, the raids are not merely about convenience stores or immigrant labor. They are a test case for America's ability to balance law, economics, and national security in an age of hybrid threats. The strategic message is unmistakable. The battle for U.S. resilience is being fought as much in local franchises as it is in global theaters. The September 2025 ICE raids against nearly 100 7-Eleven franchises marked the largest workplace enforcement operation in recent U.S. history. More than 1,200 fake IDs were seized, dozens arrested, and corporate compliance thrust into the spotlight. Through the lens of a seasoned analyst, the raids illustrated a deliberate strategy target the employer magnet fueling undocumented migration, dismantle forged identity supply chains linked to organized crime, and project deterrence across the labor market. Operationally, the raids showcased military-style coordination with synchronized warrants, interagency intelligence fusion, and nationwide deployment. Yet the aftershocks were significant franchise disruptions, economic ripple effects, and heightened fear within immigrant communities. The strategic trajectory points toward mandatory e-verify reforms, biometric verification, and expanded corporate liability, aligning immigration enforcement with national security doctrine. Allies in NATO and beyond see parallels in their own migrant labor challenges, while adversaries may test America's domestic resilience as part of broader hybrid conflict strategies. Ultimately, the raids represent more than law enforcement. They are a benchmark in America's struggle to balance economic stability, community trust, and national security under President Trump's leadership.